The notification popped up on my phone screen as I lay in the hospital bed, still groggy from the anesthesia. My daughter Sarah had posted a photo on social media, her husband Marcus grinning widely beside their two kids, Emma and Tyler, all four of them standing in front of a massive castle at Disney World. The caption read, "Best family vacation ever." Sometimes you just have to live in the moment. The timestamp showed it was posted just 3 hours after I'd been wheeled into surgery. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I stared at that photo until my vision blurred, but not from the medication. They were supposed to be here. Sarah had promised she'd be in the waiting room when I woke up from my gallbladder surgery. Instead, she was hundreds of miles away, living her best life while I recovered alone from what the doctors had warned could be a complicated procedure due to my age and underlying health conditions. The nurse walked in with a gentle smile, checking my vitals and adjusting my IV. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Clark? Any family coming to visit today?" I looked at her kind face and couldn't find the words to explain that my family was currently enjoying churros and roller coasters while I figured out how to get myself home from the hospital. "My name is Vivian Clark, and for 73 years I believed that love meant putting everyone else's needs before your own. I had built my entire identity around being the reliable one, the generous one, the mother and grandmother who never said no." Looking back now, I can see how carefully I had constructed that role, like building a house with no foundation, beautiful on the surface but destined to collapse. After my husband Robert died 8 years ago, I threw myself even deeper into caring for my family. Robert had been my anchor for 45 years, the steady presence who reminded me that I mattered too. When we lost him to a sudden heart attack, I felt like half of myself had been ripped away. The grief was so overwhelming that the only way I could cope was to focus entirely on everyone else's needs. If I kept busy enough, if I gave enough, maybe the aching emptiness inside me wouldn't feel so vast. Sarah was 38 then, already married to Marcus and raising 8-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Tyler. She had always been independent, the kind of child who packed her own lunches and did her homework without being asked. But after Robert's death, she seemed to soften toward me, inviting me over for dinner more often, calling to check in during the week. I mistook this kindness for genuine connection, not realizing that grief had made me vulnerable to interpreting any attention as love. The transformation happened gradually, so slowly that I didn't notice I was becoming less of a person and more of a resource. It started with small requests that seemed perfectly reasonable. Sarah would call on a Saturday morning, voice slightly strained, asking if I could watch the kids because Marcus had a work emergency, and she had a hair appointment she'd been waiting weeks for. Of course I said yes. The children were my joy, and I had nothing but time. Then came the financial requests, always presented as temporary solutions to unexpected problems. The washing machine broke, and they needed $800 to replace it before the weekend. Tyler needed new soccer equipment, and the registration fees were due immediately. Emma wanted to take dance classes, but they required the full year's tuition up front. Each request came with genuine gratitude and promises to pay me back. Promises that somehow got forgotten as new emergencies arose. I found myself becoming the family's unofficial banker, babysitter, and emergency contact all rolled into one. When the school called because Emma was sick, they called me first because Sarah was in meetings all day and couldn't be reached. When Tyler forgot his science project at home, I was the one who dropped everything to drive it to school. When Marcus's mother visited from out of town and they needed someone to entertain her because she didn't get along with Marcus, I was the one who took her shopping and out to lunch for 3 days straight. The house I shared with Robert had become too big after he passed, too quiet, too filled with memories that made me ache. But instead of downsizing sensibly, I held onto it because it had become the family gathering place. Every holiday, every birthday, every Sunday dinner happened in my dining room around the table Robert had built with his own hands. I convinced myself I was preserving family traditions, but really I was buying my place at the table with real estate and home-cooked meals. I spent thousands renovating the basement into a playroom for Emma and Tyler, complete with a big screen TV, gaming systems, and every toy they mentioned wanting. I installed a pool in the backyard because Marcus had mentioned how much the kids would love to swim in the summer. I replaced all the guest room furniture so visiting family members would be comfortable. Each improvement felt like an investment in love, a way to ensure that my home remained the center of our family universe. The requests for help became more frequent and more substantial. Sarah needed me to co-sign a loan for a new car because her credit had taken a hit after some medical bills. Marcus asked if I could help with the down payment on their house refinancing because interest rates were at historic lows and they'd save thousands in the long run. I liquidated part of my retirement savings and convinced myself it was smart financial planning for the whole family. When Sarah went back to work full-time, I became the children's after-school caregiver without any formal arrangement or discussion. It just evolved naturally. Sarah would call around noon and mention that she had to stay late for a client meeting. Could I pick up the kids and keep them until 7? Of course I could. Soon it was happening 3 days a week. Then 4, then every day. I was essentially providing full-time childcare, but we never talked about it as a job or responsibility. It was just what grandmothers did, according to Sarah. I loved Emma and Tyler deeply, genuinely, but I began to notice that my relationship with them was different from the one I'd had with Sarah at their age. They were polite but distant, the way children are with babysitters rather than family members. They followed my rules because they had to, not because they respected me. When they talked about their family, they meant Sarah, Marcus, and each other. I was more like a helpful neighbor who happened to share their DNA. The breaking point in this phase of my life came not with drama, but with a simple realization during Tyler's 10th birthday party. I had spent the entire previous week planning and preparing, ordering decorations, baking his favorite chocolate cake from scratch, coordinating with other parents, organizing games and activities. I had insisted on hosting it at my house, because my backyard was bigger and I had more space for all the children. During the party, I noticed that I was the only adult not sitting down. While Sarah chatted with the other mothers and Marcus talked sports with the fathers, I was serving food, cleaning up spills, refilling drinks, and managing the children's activity. When it came time to sing Happy Birthday, I was in the kitchen getting candles, and couldn't even participate in the song. I watched through the kitchen window as Tyler blew out his candles, surrounded by family and friends, and realized I wasn't really part of the celebration. I was the hired help. Later that evening, as I was finishing the dishes while Sarah and Marcus relaxed in my living room, Tyler ran up to thank me for the party, but instead of a hug or genuine appreciation, he handed me a $10 bill and said, "Mom said to give you this for all your work today." I stared at that crumpled bill and felt something inside me crack. I had been reduced to paid help in my own home, at my own grandson's party, and everyone thought that was appropriate. I didn't say anything that night. I smiled, tucked the $10 into Tyler's pocket, and told him to save it for something special. But as I lay in bed later, surrounded by the silence of my big empty house, I began to understand that somewhere along the way, I had trained my family to see me, not as a person with my own needs and feelings, but as a service provider. And the most heartbreaking part was that I had done it willingly, eagerly, believing that my worth was measured by how much I could give. The medical issues started about 6 months before my surgery. I had been experiencing abdominal pain that I initially dismissed as indigestion or stress. At 73, I had learned to expect various aches and pains as part of aging. But the pain was getting worse, especially after eating, and I was starting to feel nauseated and exhausted all the time. When I finally went to see Dr. Martinez, my longtime physician, she immediately ordered blood tests and an ultrasound. The results showed that my gallbladder was severely inflamed and full of stones. She explained that I would need surgery, and given my age and the severity of the inflammation, it couldn't wait much longer. The procedure itself wasn't particularly dangerous, but recovery would take several weeks, and I would need help during the first few days. I called Sarah to tell her about the diagnosis, expecting concern and offers of support. Instead, her first response was frustration about the timing. "Mom, this is such bad timing," she said, her voice tight with annoyance. "Emma has that big dance recital next month, and Tyler's soccer season is just starting. Marcus is traveling for work more than usual. Can't you wait until things calm down a bit? I explained that Dr. Martinez had emphasized the urgency of the surgery, that waiting could lead to serious complications. Sarah sighed heavily and said she'd figure something out, but her tone made it clear that my health crisis was primarily an inconvenience to her schedule. She didn't ask how I was feeling or if I was scared. She didn't offer to come with me to the pre-surgical consultation or help me prepare for the recovery period. When I mentioned that I would need someone to drive me to and from the hospital, and ideally stay with me for the first couple of days afterward, Sarah's response was to suggest I hire a home health aide. Insurance probably covers it, Mom, and honestly, you'd get better care from a professional than from us fumbling around trying to help. The casual way she dismissed the idea of family support stung, but I told myself she was probably right. Professional care would be more reliable. I scheduled the surgery for a Tuesday in March, giving everyone plenty of advance notice. I called Sarah to confirm that she'd be available to at least visit me in the hospital, if not stay with me afterward. She assured me that of course she'd be there, that family came first.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
And that she was sorry for seeming stressed about it earlier. Her warm reassurance melted away my earlier hurt feelings, and I felt foolish for doubting her commitment to being there when I needed her. The week before my surgery, Sarah called with exciting news. Marcus had won some kind of sales contest at work, and the prize was a family vacation package to Disney World. The trip was already paid for, but they had to use it within a specific time frame because of blackout dates and expiration policies. The only available dates that would work with the kids' spring break were the exact week of my surgery. I feel terrible about the timing, Mom, Sarah said, and she did sound genuinely conflicted. But this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the kids. Marcus worked so hard for this, and Emma and Tyler have never been to Disney World. The dates are completely non-negotiable, and if we don't go then we lose the whole package. You understand, right? I wanted to say no. I didn't understand. I wanted to ask why a vacation was more important than being there when your mother had surgery. I wanted to point out that there would be other opportunities for family trips, but there was only one time I would need them, by my side during a frightening medical procedure. Instead, I heard myself saying, "Of course, sweetheart. The kids will have such wonderful memories. Don't worry about me. I'll be fine." Sarah's relief was audible. "You're amazing, Mom. I knew you'd understand. We'll take tons of pictures to show you, and I'll call you every day to check in. The surgery is routine anyway, right? You'll probably be home and feeling great before we even get back." I convinced myself that she was right, that I was being overly dramatic about a simple surgical procedure. Plenty of people had gallbladder surgery and recovered just fine without family hovering around them. I was a strong, independent woman who had raised children and managed a household, and survived the loss of her husband. I could certainly handle a few days of recovery on my own. But as the surgery date approached and I went through all the preoperative preparations alone, signing consent forms, meeting with the anesthesiologist, arranging for post-surgical care, I felt increasingly isolated and forgotten. Sarah had stopped calling as frequently, caught up in the excitement of planning their vacation. When she did call, the conversations were rushed and focused on their travel logistics rather than my upcoming procedure. The night before my surgery, I sat in my quiet house trying to distract myself with television and knitting. I had packed a small bag for the hospital and arranged for a taxi to pick me up in the morning. The home health aide wouldn't start until the day after surgery, so I would be spending that first night alone. I told myself this was normal, that I was being strong and independent, but deep down I felt abandoned and afraid. I had given so much of myself to my family, sacrificed my own needs and desires to support theirs, and when I finally needed something in return, they were at the happiest place on earth, posting cheerful photos while I faced surgery alone. That realization felt like a physical pain in my chest, separate from the gallbladder symptoms, but somehow much worse. I was about to learn that sometimes the most devastating moments in life come not with dramatic confrontations, but with the quiet recognition that you have become invisible to the people you love most. The surgery itself went smoothly, according to Dr. Martinez. I woke up in the recovery room feeling disoriented and nauseated, my abdomen tender and wrapped in bandages. The nurse, a kind woman named Patricia, explained that everything had gone according to plan, and that I would be moved to a regular room shortly. She asked if I wanted her to call anyone to let them know I was awake. I almost gave her Sarah's number out of habit, then remembered that my daughter was probably standing in line for Space Mountain at that very moment. No, I told Patricia quietly. There's no one to call. The look of sympathy that crossed her face made me realize how pathetic I must have sounded. Here I was, a woman who had spent decades surrounded by family, who had hosted countless gatherings and celebrations, and I couldn't name a single person who would want to know I had survived surgery. The loneliness hit me like a physical blow, making it hard to breathe around the oxygen mask. They moved me to a semi-private room where my roommate was a woman about my age recovering from hip replacement surgery. Her room overflowed with flowers, balloons, and get-well cards. A steady stream of visitors came throughout the day, her children, grandchildren, neighbors and friends from church. I watched this parade of love and support from my bed, which remained stubbornly empty of any signs that I mattered to anyone. The first real crack in my carefully constructed denial came when Patricia brought me a dinner tray that evening. As she helped me sit up to eat, she mentioned that she had 2 children of her own and couldn't imagine not being there if either of them had surgery. Family is everything, she said simply, arranging my utensils within easy reach. I'm sure your people will be here soon. I nodded and tried to look confident, but her words echoed in my head as I picked at the bland hospital food. My people. Where were my people? I had spent so many years being everyone else's person, always available, always willing to drop everything to help, but when I needed someone to simply show up, to hold my hand and tell me everything would be okay, I was alone. Around 8 o'clock that evening, my phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. Hope surgery went well. We're having the most amazing time. Kids are exhausted but so happy. We'll call tomorrow when we have a quiet moment. Love you. Attached were 3 photos, Emma and Tyler grinning with Mickey Mouse ears. The whole family posed in front of Cinderella Castle, and a shot of them eating enormous ice cream sundaes. I stared at those photos until my vision blurred with tears I hadn't expected. They looked so carefree, so joyful, so completely unburdened by any thought of me lying alone in a hospital bed. The contrast between their magical vacation and my sterile, lonely recovery felt like a betrayal so profound I couldn't find words for it. But the worst part wasn't the photos themselves, it was the realization that Sarah felt comfortable enough to send them to me, confident that I would respond with enthusiasm about their fun instead of hurt about my abandonment. She knew me well enough to predict that I would swallow my pain and celebrate their happiness, just as I always had. And she was right. I found myself typing back, "So glad you're having fun. Kids look adorable. Surgery went fine. Recovering well. Enjoy every moment." I sent that cheerful lie, and then turned my face into the pillow and cried until my chest ached worse than my surgical incisions. The next morning brought new humiliations. Dr. Martinez came by during her rounds, pleased with my progress but concerned about my discharge planning. "Who's picking you up this afternoon?" she asked, reviewing my chart. "And who'll be staying with you tonight? You really shouldn't be alone for the first 48 hours after surgery." I explained about the home health aide I had arranged, trying to make it sound like a choice rather than a necessity. Dr. Martinez frowned slightly. "That's good for medical care, but you'll also need emotional support. Surgery can be more traumatic than people realize, especially at your age. Having family around helps with the healing process." When she left, I called the home health agency to confirm the aide's arrival time. The woman on the phone was brisk and professional, explaining that Mrs. Rodriguez would arrive at my house at 6 that evening and stay until 8 the following morning. She would help with basic needs like getting to the bathroom, preparing simple meals, and monitoring my recovery, but she wasn't a companion or emotional support person. She was strictly medical assistance. I hung up feeling even more isolated. I was paying a stranger to do what family should do naturally, and even that stranger was only providing the bare minimum of care required to keep me safe. There would be no hand-holding, no gentle reassurance, no one to talk to when the pain medication made me feel anxious or confused. The discharge process was a series of small indignities that highlighted my solitude. The nurse who helped me get dressed had to assist me with putting on my shoes because I couldn't bend properly yet. The wheelchair ride to the hospital entrance felt endless as we passed families reuniting with their loved ones, tearful hugs and gentle laughter filling the corridors. When the taxi arrived to take me home, the driver was kind but clearly just doing his job, not genuinely caring about my well-being. My house felt different when I walked through the front door. The silence was oppressive in a way it had never been before. Usually I found peace in the quiet of my own space, but now it felt like evidence of my irrelevance. The rooms that had once hosted so many family gatherings now seemed to mock me with their emptiness. All those renovations I had done, all the money I had spent making this place perfect for everyone else's visits, and here I was recovering from surgery completely alone. Mrs. Rodriguez arrived promptly at 6, a competent woman in her 50s who immediately took charge of my care. She was professional and kind, but our relationship was clearly transactional. She helped me with medications, prepared a simple dinner, and made sure I could safely navigate to the bathroom during the night. But when I tried to make conversation about my family or share my feelings about the surgery, she gently redirected me back to medical concerns. She wasn't paid to be my friend or therapist. That night, as Ms. Rodriguez dozed in the guest room chair, and I lay awake listening to the house settle around us, I felt more alone than I ever had in my entire life. Even during the darkest days of grief after Robert's death, I had known that people cared about me, that my pain mattered to someone. Now I wondered if I could disappear entirely, and how long it would take for anyone to notice. My phone sat silent on the nightstand, no calls from Sarah checking on my recovery. No texts from Emma or Tyler asking how Grandma was feeling. No flowers delivered from concerned family members. Nothing. It was as if my surgery had happened to someone else entirely, someone who didn't matter enough to warrant even basic concern. The second day of recovery brought the social media posts that shattered what remained of my illusions about my place in my family's priority. Sarah had been actively posting throughout their vacation, and I found myself compulsively checking her accounts, despite knowing it would only hurt me more. There were videos of the kids screaming with delight on roller coasters, photos of elaborate character breakfasts, and countless shots of the family looking blissfully happy. But it was Marcus's post that delivered the killing blow. He had shared a group photo of the 4 of them at Epcot with a caption that read, "Sometimes you have to make tough choices about what matters most. So grateful we decided to prioritize this family time together. These moments with my wife and kids are priceless. No regrets about putting family first." I read that caption over and over, each word cutting deeper than the last. Putting family first. No regrets, as if choosing a vacation over being there for his mother-in-law's surgery was some kind of noble family values decision. As if I wasn't family at all, just an obligation they had successfully avoided. The comments on his post made it even worse, friends and relatives responding with heart emojis and messages about how wonderful it was to see a man who prioritized his children. Sarah's sister commenting, "You guys are such amazing parents. The kids will remember this forever." Her mother-in-law writing, "So proud of a son who knows what really matters." I wanted to scream at the screen. What about the grandmother who had helped raise those children? What about the woman who had funded their activities, provided free childcare, and opened her home for every celebration? Did I not qualify as family worth considering? Had I become so invisible that my absence from their thoughts didn't even register as callousness? Mrs. Rodriguez found me crying over my phone that afternoon, and gently suggested I might want to limit social media while I was recovering. "Pain medication can make emotions more intense," she said kindly. "Maybe focus on healing your body first, then worry about other things later." But this wasn't medication-induced emotional instability. This was the clear-eyed recognition that I had spent years training my family to take me for granted, and they had learned the lesson perfectly. I had never set boundaries, never said no, never demanded that my needs be considered alongside theirs. I had taught them that I would always be available, always understanding, always willing to sacrifice my own well-being for their convenience. The breaking point came that evening when Sarah finally called, not to check on my recovery, but to share exciting news about their day at Hollywood Studio. She launched into an animated description of the rides they had experienced, the characters they had met, and the special dinner they had at a themed restaurant. Her voice was bright with happiness, completely oblivious to the pain she was causing. "Mom, you should see Tyler's face when he met Buzz Lightyear," she gushed, "and Emma got chosen to help with a magic show. I've never seen them so excited. This trip is exactly what our family needed. We've been so stressed with work and school and everything, and this is just pure joy." I listened to her enthusiasm and felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. She talked for 10 minutes about their wonderful vacation before asking, almost as an afterthought, "Oh, how are you feeling? Everything go okay with the surgery?" "Fine," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "Everything went fine." "That's great, Mom. I knew you'd be okay. You're so strong. Oh, Marcus wants to say hi." Marcus came on the line with the same cheerful energy, describing the hotel amenities and the park attractions, as if I were a friend he was trying to convince to visit Disney World myself someday. He talked about the weather, the crowds, the quality of the food, everything except the fact that I had been under anesthesia while he was enjoying a character breakfast. When they handed the phone back to Sarah, I found myself saying something I had never said before. "I needed you here." The words came out quietly, but they seemed to echo in the sudden silence on the other end of the line. Sarah's voice changed, becoming cautious and slightly defensive. "Mom, you said you understood about the timing. You said it was fine." "I said what you needed me to say," I replied, and even as I spoke, I marveled at my own honesty. "But I needed my daughter here when I had surgery. I needed someone to care enough to stay." Sarah's response revealed everything I needed to know about how she viewed our relationship. "Mom, you're being dramatic. It was routine surgery. You're fine. And this opportunity was once in a lifetime. The kids will remember this forever. Surely you don't want us to give up something this special just to sit around a hospital room." There it was. The choice had been framed not as missing my surgery versus enjoying a vacation, but as denying her children magical memories versus indulging my dramatic need for attention. In her mind, I was being selfish for expecting basic support during a medical procedure. "You're right," I said finally. "The children's memories are important. I knew you'd understand," Sarah said, relief flooding her voice. "You're the best mom ever. We'll bring you back something special from the gift shop." After we hung up, I sat in my quiet house with Miss Rodriguez reading in the next room, and I felt something fundamental shift inside me. It wasn't anger, exactly, though that would come later. It was more like the feeling you get when you finally understand a complex problem that had been puzzling you for years. All the pieces clicked into place, and the picture they formed was devastating but clear. I had raised my daughter to believe that my love was unconditional and inexhaustible, that I would always sacrifice my own needs for hers, that I would always understand and forgive and make excuses for her choice. I had been so successful at this that she genuinely couldn't comprehend why I would expect anything different. In her mind, she was being generous by calling to check on me at all. The final devastation came the next morning when Emma and Tyler called to tell me about their adventure. They were sweet and excited, bubbling over with stories about the rides and shows and characters they had encountered. But when I asked if they had thought about Grandma at all during their trip, Tyler said cheerfully, "We were too busy having fun to think about anything else." Emma added, "Mommy said you were sleeping a lot anyway because of your surgery, so we didn't want to bother you." That's when I understood that Sarah had deliberately framed my surgery as something minor and inconsequential, something that would require nothing more than extra sleep. She had protected her children from feeling any guilt about their vacation by minimizing the significance of my medical procedure. They genuinely believed I was just taking a little nap while they rode roller coasters. When I hung up from that call, I looked around my beautiful house, my perfectly appointed home that I had maintained as a shrine to family togetherness, and I saw it clearly for the first time. It wasn't a family gathering place. It was a hotel where my relatives stayed when it was convenient for them, a restaurant where they came for free meals, a bank where they made withdrawals without deposit. I had spent so many years being the one who gave, who accommodated, who understood that I had forgotten I was supposed to be getting something in return. Love isn't supposed to be a one-way transaction. Family isn't supposed to be a performance where only some people get to be the audience while others exist solely to serve. Mrs. Rodriguez left that afternoon after ensuring I could manage my basic needs safely. As I watched her car disappear down my driveway, I felt the weight of my solitude differently than I had before. It wasn't just loneliness anymore, it was clarity. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I was seeing my life without the filter of other people's expectations and demands. The house felt different now, not empty but spacious. The silence wasn't oppressive but peaceful. I had space to think, to feel, to consider what I wanted instead of what everyone else needed from me. And what I realized, sitting alone in my recovery chair with nothing but my own thoughts for company, was that I was tired of being taken for granted. I was tired of being the one who always understood, always forgave, always made it easy for other people to treat me poorly. I wasn't angry yet, but I was awake, and that awakening would change everything. The weeks following my surgery blurred together in a haze of physical healing and emotional numbness. My body recovered according to schedule, the incisions healed cleanly, and my energy slowly returned. But something else had broken during those days of abandonment that couldn't be mended with rest and medication. I moved through my daily routines, like a ghost, haunting my own life, going through the motions of living without feeling truly alive. Sarah and her family returned from their Disney vacation full of stories and souvenir gifts, as if the trip had been a wonderful surprise, rather than a deliberate choice to prioritize entertainment over family obligation. They visited me exactly once after their return, staying just long enough to show me their vacation photos and present me with a Mickey Mouse coffee mug that probably cost them $12 at the gift shop. Emma and Tyler were still buzzing with excitement, chattering about their favorite rides and shows, while I sat in my living room chair, still moving carefully due to my healing incision. They were animated and happy, completely oblivious to the fact that their grandmother had spent the most frightening week of her recent life entirely alone. Sarah sat on my couch scrolling through her phone, occasionally looking up to add details to the children's stories, or to show me another batch of photos. Marcus dominated the conversation with his analysis of Disney's business model, the efficiency of their operations, and his plans to take the family back again next year, maybe during Christmas when the decorations would be especially spectacular. He spoke with the enthusiasm of someone describing a life-changing experience, as if this vacation had been some kind of spiritual awakening rather than a simple entertainment choice. When Tyler mentioned that he had bought me a special gift with his own souvenir money, I felt a flicker of hope that maybe someone had thought of me during their magical week. He proudly presented me with a small snow globe, containing a miniature Cinderella castle. "I remembered you like pretty things for your shelves," he said earnestly, and I could see he genuinely believed this gesture would make up for everything. I thanked him with what enthusiasm I could muster, but as I held that cheap trinket, all I could think about was the irony. They had spent thousands of dollars on their vacation, money that could have paid for private nursing care or a comfortable recovery suite, and my consolation prize was a $5 snow globe. The gesture wasn't meaningful, it was perfunctory, something to check off a list, so Tyler could feel good about remembering Grandma. The visit lasted less than 2 hours. Sarah mentioned that they were all exhausted from the trip and needed to get home to unpack and prepare for the week ahead. She kissed my cheek absently and promised to call soon, though we both knew that soon might mean next month or when she needed something from me. They left behind only the lingering scent of sunscreen and the faint sound of Emma humming "It's a Small World" as they walked to their car. After they drove away, I sat in my chair, holding Tyler's snow globe, and felt something die inside me. Not dramatically, not with tears or anger, but with a quiet resignation that felt worse than grief. Grief, at least, acknowledged that something valuable had been lost. What I felt was more like the recognition that I had been mourning something that had never really existed in the first place. The days that followed took on a strange, suspended quality. I moved through my house like a tourist in someone else's life, noticing details I had never seen before. The family photos lining my hallway showed a clear pattern I had never recognized. I was always in the background, always serving, always focused on someone else. Even in pictures from my own birthday parties, I was shown cutting cake or pouring drinks rather than being celebrated. I found myself drawn to my bedroom closet, staring at clothes I hadn't worn in years, dresses I had bought for special occasions that never came, jewelry Robert had given me that I saved for events that seemed important enough. When had I stopped thinking I deserved to wear beautiful things just for myself? When had I decided that my own pleasure and comfort were less important than everyone else's convenience? The loneliness during this period was unlike anything I had experienced, even in the immediate aftermath of Robert's death. When he passed away, I had been surrounded by sympathy and support, casseroles and condolence cards, people checking on me and offering help. This loneliness was different because it came with the recognition that I had trained people to ignore my needs so thoroughly that they couldn't see my pain even when it was obvious. I stopped answering my phone for several days, partly because it rarely rang and partly because I couldn't bear to pretend everything was normal when someone did call. When Sarah finally noticed my silence and left a voicemail asking if I was okay, her tone was more annoyed than concerned, as if my failure to be available was an inconvenience rather than a sign that something might be wrong. During this period of isolation, I began to notice my surroundings with fresh eyes. My house was beautiful, perfectly maintained, and completely oriented toward other people's comfort. The guest rooms were more luxurious than my own bedroom. The playroom in the basement was equipped with every possible entertainment option for visiting grandchildren, while my own living spaces were sparse and utilitarian. Even my kitchen was organized around hosting others rather than nourishing myself, with elaborate serving pieces and entertainment supplies, but only basic equipment for simple meals. I realized I had been living like a hotel manager rather than a homeowner, maintaining a property for other people's use, while treating my own comfort as an afterthought. This revelation led to others, equally disturbed. When was the last time I had bought something purely because I wanted it, not because it would please someone else, or make hosting easier? When had I last made plans based on my own interests rather than my availability to help others? The financial review I conducted during this period was sobering in ways I hadn't expected. I had always been careful with money, but I had never calculated exactly how much I had spent supporting my family over the year. When I sat down with my bank statements and credit card records, the numbers were staggering. Between the loans I had co-signed, the emergencies I had funded, the home improvements I had made for their benefit, and the countless smaller expenses I had absorbed, I had spent nearly $200,000 of my retirement savings on other people's convenience and comfort. This wasn't money I had given as generous gifts during prosperous times. This was money I had diverted from my own security and future, money that was supposed to ensure my own comfort in old age. I had been so focused on being the generous matriarch, the family member who never said no to a request for help, that I had sacrificed my own financial stability without even fully realizing it. The most painful discovery came when I reviewed my will and estate planning document. I had structured everything to benefit Sarah and the grandchildren, as most parents do, but I had done so with the assumption that this generosity would be reciprocated with care and attention during my lifetime. Reading through the beneficiary designations and inheritance plans, I felt like I was looking at a contract where only one party had obligation. My life insurance, my retirement accounts, my house, my investments, everything was designated to flow to people who couldn't be bothered to visit me in the hospital or call to check on my recovery. I was planning to leave a substantial inheritance to individuals who treated me like an automated teller machine, available for withdrawals but not worthy of personal attention or genuine care. The thought that haunted me most during these dark weeks was what would have happened if my surgery had gone badly. What if there had been complications? What if I had died on the operating table while they were riding roller coasters and eating cotton candy? Would they have cut their vacation short to attend my funeral? Or would they have waited until they got home to deal with that inconvenience too? I imagined Sarah getting the call from the hospital while she was watching the fireworks at Magic Kingdom. I pictured her having to explain to Emma and Tyler that Grandma had died while they were having the time of their lives. Would they have felt guilty? Or would Sarah have found a way to frame even that as not their fault? Just an unfortunate coincidence that no one could have predicted. These thoughts weren't morbid fantasies. They were practical considerations that forced me to confront the reality of my relationships. If I had died during surgery, My family would have inherited everything I had worked my entire life to accumulate, and they would have done so without ever having to sacrifice anything for my benefit. They would have gotten the reward without paying any of the cost. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday afternoon, about 6 weeks after my surgery. I was sitting in my kitchen drinking tea and watching the water run down my windows, when the mailman delivered a large envelope from my attorney's office. Inside was the updated will I had requested months earlier, a document that reflected recent changes in tax law and included some minor adjustments to my bequest. As I read through the legal language describing how my assets would be distributed after my death, I felt a strange detachment, as if I were reading about someone else's life. The woman described in these documents was generous to a fault, leaving everything to family members who would benefit enormously from her lifetime of careful saving and wise investing. But that woman was also a fool, someone who had confused being useful with being loved. I set the will aside and walked through my house, really looking at it for the first time in years. Every room told the story of someone who had prioritized other people's happiness over her own. The formal dining room where I had hosted countless family dinners, always cooking and serving while others enjoyed themselves. The guest bedrooms where visiting relatives had stayed comfortably while I slept on a 20-year-old mattress, because replacing it seemed like an unnecessary expense. The basement playroom that had cost me $15,000 to create, money I had withdrawn from my retirement account because Emma and Tyler needed a place to play when they visited. They had used it exactly 3 times before deciding they preferred playing upstairs where the adults were. Now it sat empty, a monument to my desperate desire to buy affection with real estate improvements. But it was my own bedroom that brought me to tears. Sparse, practical, almost monastic in its simplicity. The furniture was old but functional, the decorations minimal, the overall feeling more like a guest room than the private sanctuary of someone who had lived in this house for 30 years. I had given the best of everything to others while accepting leftovers for myself, and I had done it so consistently that it had become invisible even to me. That night I called my attorney and asked to schedule an appointment to discuss updating my estate plan. Not minor adjustments, but a complete overhaul. When his secretary asked what had prompted this decision, I found myself saying something I had never articulated before. I've realized that my current plan rewards people for treating me poorly, and I think it's time to change that. The attorney, Mr. Peterson, had handled my family's legal affairs for over 20 years. He had drafted the original will when Robert and I were young parents, updated it when the children were born, and revised it again after Robert's death. He knew my family well enough to understand the dynamics that had shaped my previous estate planning decisions. When I explained that I wanted to remove Sarah as the primary beneficiary of my estate, Mr. Peterson was careful to remain professionally neutral, but I could see the surprise in his eyes. "Mrs. Clark," he said gently, "this is obviously a significant decision. Have you discussed this with your daughter?" Sometimes family disagreements can be resolved through conversation rather than legal action. I explained about the surgery, the vacation, the pattern of taking me for granted that had become so established that Sarah genuinely couldn't understand why I might be hurt by her choices. I described the years of financial support that had never been acknowledged or reciprocated, the countless sacrifices that had been accepted as my natural role rather than generous gifts. Mr. Peterson listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions about my intentions and motivations. He explained the legal options available to me, the ways I could structure my estate to reflect my current feelings while still providing some security for my grandchildren. He also warned me about the potential consequences of making such dramatic changes, the family upheaval that would inevitably follow when my decisions became known. "I understand that you're hurt," he said finally, "and I can see why you would want to send a message about how you expect to be treated. But estate planning is permanent. Once you're gone, you won't be able to explain your reasoning or change your mind if circumstances improve. Are you certain you want to make decisions this significant while you're still processing the pain of feeling abandoned?" His question was fair and thoughtful, but it also revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of my situation. This wasn't a reaction to a single incident or a temporary emotional state. This was the culmination of years of recognizing patterns I had been too afraid or too hopeful to acknowledge. The surgery and vacation had simply been the final piece of evidence in a case I had been building against myself for decades. I told Mr. Peterson that I needed time to think about my options, but that I was serious about making changes. I wasn't acting out of spite or temporary anger, but out of a desire to align my financial legacy with my values and expectations for how family members should treat each other. After leaving his office, I drove to the cemetery where Robert was buried. I hadn't visited his grave since the anniversary of his death 8 months earlier, not because I didn't miss him, but because I had been too busy managing everyone else's lives to tend to my own grief and memory. Standing beside his headstone in the late afternoon light, I found myself talking to him about the decision I was contemplating. Robert had always been my moral compass, the person who helped me navigate difficult choices with wisdom and compassion. I knew he would want me to be fair, but also to protect myself from being exploited. I don't know what to do, I said aloud, feeling foolish but also comforted by the familiar ritual of seeking his guidance. I love them, but I don't think they love me the same way. I think they love what I do for them, not who I am. And I don't know how to change that without changing everything. As I stood there in the gathering dusk, I remembered something Robert used to say when the children were young and testing boundaries. You teach people how to treat you by what you're willing to accept. I had been teaching my family for years that I would accept neglect, that I would forgive abandonment, that I would always be available regardless of how they treated me. Maybe it was time to teach them something different. The drive home felt like a journey between two versions of myself. The woman who had spent 73 years prioritizing everyone else's needs, and the woman who was beginning to consider that her own needs might matter too. I wasn't sure yet which version would ultimately prevail, but for the first time in my adult life I felt like I had a choice in the matter. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a legal pad, and began making 2 lists. The first was everything I had given my family over the years: money, time, care, support, forgiveness, understanding. The second was everything I had received in return. The contrast was stark enough to take my breath away. I wasn't ready to make any final decisions yet, but I was ready to stop pretending that the current arrangement was working for me. Change was coming, whether I initiated it or simply allowed it to happen naturally. The only question was whether I would be an active participant in reshaping my life, or a passive victim of other people's indifference. For the first time in months, that question felt like it had an answer I could live with. The decision to reclaim my life didn't come with fanfare or dramatic revelation. It began quietly on a Tuesday morning when I woke up and realized I couldn't remember the last time I had done something purely for my own enjoyment. The thought struck me as I was making coffee in my pristine kitchen, surrounded by appliances I had purchased for entertaining others, and dishes I only used when hosting family dinner. I stood there holding my plain white mug, the same one I used every morning because the prettier cups were saved for guests, and something inside me rebelled against this constant deferral of my own pleasure. Why was I saving the good china for people who barely noticed what they were eating off of? Why was I living like a caretaker in my own home? That morning I walked deliberately to my dining room cabinet, and pulled out the delicate porcelain cup and saucer that had been my mother's, pieces I had been saving for special occasions that never seemed special enough. I poured my coffee into the beautiful cup, sat in my sunny breakfast nook and drank it slowly, savoring both the taste and the small act of rebellion against my own self-imposed restrictions. It was such a tiny gesture, but it felt revolutionary. For the first time in years, I was treating myself as someone worthy of beautiful things, someone whose daily comfort mattered enough to warrant using the good dishes. That single cup of coffee became the first step in a journey I didn't yet fully understand. Over the following days, I began making other small changes that prioritized my own experience over the maintenance of my house as a shrine to family gathering. I moved the comfortable reading chair from the guest room into my bedroom, creating a cozy corner where I could enjoy morning coffee and evening tea in private comfort. I bought fresh flowers for my nightstand, not for entertaining but simply because their beauty made me happy. I started cooking meals I enjoyed rather than keeping the refrigerator stocked with foods my family preferred for their occasional visits. For the first time in decades, I bought exotic ingredients that intrigued me, spices and sauces I had never tried because they weren't crowd pleasers. I discovered that I loved the complexity of Mediterranean flavors and the heat of proper Indian curry, tastes I had never explored because they were too adventurous for family dinner. These culinary experiments led me to sign up for a cooking class at the community college, something I had always wanted to do but never felt I had time for between family obligations. The class met Thursday evenings and covered international cuisine, techniques I had never learned during my years of preparing familiar comfort foods for large family gatherings. The other students in the class were mostly people like me, older adults with grown children who were finally pursuing interests they had postponed during their active parenting year. There was Margaret, a retired teacher who wanted to learn French cooking techniques, and David, a widower who was tired of eating frozen dinners and wanted to develop some kitchen skills. We bonded over our shared status as beginners, laughing at our mistakes and celebrating our success. For the first time in years, I was part of a group where I wasn't the caretaker organizer. I wasn't responsible for anyone else's experience or enjoyment. I could focus entirely on my own learning and pleasure, and it felt strange and wonderful to be so purely selfish with my attention and energy. The friendships that developed in that cooking class were different from any relationships I had maintained during my years of intensive family caretaking. These people knew me only as Vivian, not as someone's mother or grandmother or emergency contact. They were interested in my opinions about flavor combinations and cooking techniques, not my availability to babysit or lend money. Our conversations covered travel, books, current events, and personal interest rather than family obligations and household management. Margaret invited me to join her book club, a group of 8 women who met monthly to discuss literary fiction and memoir. I hadn't read a book for pleasure in over 3 years, having convinced myself I was too busy with family responsibilities to indulge in such leisure activity. The first book they assigned was a novel about a woman who left her conventional life to study art in Italy, and I found myself staying up past midnight to finish it, completely absorbed in a story about someone choosing her own dreams over other people's expectations. The book club discussions were intellectually stimulating in ways I had forgotten were possible. These women engaged with ideas passionately, disagreeing and debating with good humor and genuine curiosity about different perspectives. I realized how much I had missed having conversations that challenged my thinking rather than simply coordinating schedules and solving other people's problems. Through Margaret, I also met Eleanor, a woman in her 70s who had recently started taking watercolor painting classes after her husband's death. Eleanor had a warmth and directness that I found immediately appealing, and she seemed to see something in me that even I was just beginning to recognize. "You have the look of someone who's been taking care of everyone but herself," Eleanor said one afternoon as we walked through the botanical gardens after our book club meeting. "I had that look too for about 40 years. It's amazing how quickly you can lose it once you start paying attention to your own needs." Eleanor's observation was startling in its accuracy. I had indeed been so focused on managing everyone else's happiness that I had forgotten I was supposed to have preferences and desires of my own. When she asked what I enjoyed doing for fun, I realized I couldn't answer the question. My recreational activities had all been structured around family entertainment or home maintenance. "That's your homework," Eleanor said with a smile. "Figure out what makes you happy when nobody else is watching, not what makes you useful or needed, but what brings you genuine joy. You might be surprised by what you discover." This assignment proved more challenging than I had expected. I had to actively resist my ingrained habit of thinking about how my choices would affect others, or whether they would be seen as appropriate or productive. The first activity I chose purely for my own pleasure was joining a yoga class at the local senior center. I had always been curious about yoga but had dismissed it as too self-indulgent when there were more practical ways to spend my time. The yoga instructor, a gentle woman named Lisa who was about Sarah's age, created an atmosphere of acceptance and encouragement that I hadn't experienced in years. She emphasized that yoga was about personal growth and self-care rather than performance or competition. For the first time in my adult life, I was in an environment where my only responsibility was to pay attention to my own body and mind. The physical practice was challenging but rewarding, and I found unexpected pleasure in the gradual improvement of my flexibility and balance. But the meditation component of the classes had an even more profound impact. Learning to sit quietly with my own thoughts, without the constant mental chatter of worrying about other people's needs and schedules, felt like coming home to myself after a long absence. During these meditation sessions, I began to access feelings and realizations I had been suppressing for years. I grieved not just for Robert's death, but for the gradual disappearance of my own identity into the role of family caretaker. I felt anger about the years of financial and emotional support I had provided without reciprocation. I experienced sadness about the relationships I had sacrificed, because I was always too busy with family obligations to maintain friendship. But I also felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: excitement about possibilities. For the first time since Robert's death, I had space in my life for pursuits that interested me rather than responsibilities that depleted me. I was rediscovering aspects of my personality that had been dormant for so long I had forgotten they existed. The changes in my daily routine were accompanied by changes in my living space that reflected my shifting priority. I converted the elaborate guest room that had been reserved for visiting family members into a combination art studio and reading room. I bought an easel and watercolor supplies, inspired by Eleanor's example, and set up a comfortable workspace near the window with the best natural light. I moved my extensive collection of books from storage boxes in the basement to beautiful built-in shelves in my new creative space. Many of these books had been wedding gifts or personal purchases from my early married years, volumes I had packed away when the children were young and never unpacked because I was too busy with practical concerns to indulge in reading for pleasure. Rediscovering these books felt like reconnecting with an earlier version of myself, the young woman who had been interested in poetry and philosophy and travel literature. I found journals from my 20s filled with thoughts about books I had read and places I wanted to visit, dreams I had set aside when domestic responsibilities took precedent. The basement playroom that I had created for Emma and Tyler's visits was transformed into a meditation and exercise. I donated the expensive gaming equipment and toys to a local charity and replaced them with yoga mats, meditation cushions, and a sound system for playing the relaxing music I had grown to love during my class. These physical changes to my home environment reflected the psychological transformation I was experiencing. I was reclaiming space that had been dedicated to other people's pleasure and converting it to support my own growth and happiness. The house was beginning to feel like a home designed for my comfort rather than a facility maintained for other people's convenience. The most significant change came when I decided to hire a financial advisor to help me restructure my assets and spending patterns. I had been managing my money conservatively but without any clear vision for how I wanted to use my resources during my remaining years. My financial planning had been entirely focused on preserving wealth to pass to my heirs rather than using it to enhance my own life. The advisor, a competent woman named Jennifer who specialized in retirement planning for single women, helped me understand that I had been living far below my means out of habit rather than necessity. My careful saving and Robert's excellent insurance policies meant that I could afford a much more comfortable and interesting lifestyle without jeopardizing my long-term security. "Mrs. Cleric," Jennifer said during our second meeting, "you have enough money to live very well for the rest of your life and still leave a substantial inheritance. The question is whether you want to spend your remaining years denying yourself pleasures you can easily afford in order to maximize what you leave behind, or whether you want to enjoy some of the resources you've accumulated." This perspective was revolutionary for someone who had spent decades prioritizing thrift and family financial support over personal enjoyment. Jennifer helped me create a budget that included substantial allocations for travel, hobbies, home improvements that would enhance my daily life, and experiences I had always wanted to pursue but considered too extravagant. The first major purchase I made with my new financial philosophy was a trip to Italy, something I had dreamed about since my 20s but had never pursued because there always seemed to be more pressing family financial needs. I enrolled in a 2-week painting and cooking tour that would take me through Tuscany and the Italian Riviera, combining several of my newly rediscovered interests. When I told Eleanor about my travel plans, she was thrilled for me but also perceptive about the significance of this decision. "This isn't just a vacation," she said. "This is you choosing to invest in your own happiness instead of waiting for permission from other people to enjoy your life." That's a bigger change than you might realize. Eleanor was right. Booking that trip felt like a declaration of independence from the belief system that had governed my adult life. I was choosing to spend money on my own pleasure rather than keeping it available for family emergencies or future inheritance. I was prioritizing my own dreams over my role as the family safety net. The conversations I had with my new friends about my travel plans were markedly different from any discussions I would have had with my family about such a decision. Margaret, Eleanor, and the women in my book club were enthusiastic and supportive, sharing their own travel experiences and encouraging me to be adventurous. None of them questioned whether I deserved such an expensive treat or suggested that the money would be better spent on more practical concerns. This contrast made me realize how much my family's perspective on my choices had been shaped by their investment in maintaining me as a resource, rather than supporting me as an individual with legitimate desires and aspirations. Their opinions about my spending had always been filtered through considerations of how my choices would affect their own financial security and access to my support. As my departure date approached, I made the decision not to tell Sarah about my travel plans until after I returned. This wasn't from spite or a desire to punish her with exclusion, but from a recognition that her response would likely include worry about my safety, criticism of my spending, or suggestions about how I should modify my plans to accommodate her concern. I wanted to protect the joy I felt about this adventure from being diminished by someone else's anxiety or disapproval. The weeks leading up to my departure were filled with pleasant preparations, shopping for appropriate clothing, researching the places I would visit, and learning basic Italian phrases. I felt a sense of anticipation and excitement that I hadn't experienced since my early married years when Robert and I would plan modest vacations within our limited budget. But this trip was different because it was entirely mine. I had chosen the destination, the activities, and the timeline based purely on my own interests, rather than having to consider anyone else's preferences or limitations. For the first time in decades, I was acting as the primary character in my own life, rather than a supporting player in someone else's story. The morning I left for Italy, I stood in my transformed house, surrounded by evidence of my new priorities and commitments, and felt a profound sense of completion. Not the completion of ending something, but the completion of beginning something new. I was no longer the woman who waited for other people to give her permission to pursue happiness. I was becoming someone who took responsibility for creating her own joy. As the taxi arrived to take me to the airport, I looked back at my house one more time. It no longer looked like a museum dedicated to family memories or a hotel maintained for other people's comfort. It looked like the home of someone who valued herself enough to live beautifully, someone who understood that her own happiness was worth pursuing and protecting. The woman boarding that plane to Italy was fundamentally different from the woman who had lain alone in a hospital bed just months earlier. That transformation hadn't happened through confrontation or dramatic gestures, but through the quiet, consistent choice to prioritize my own well-being alongside, rather than instead of, other people's needs. I was still a mother and grandmother who loved my family, but I was also a woman with my own dreams, interests, and resources.
And for the first time in my adult life, those identities felt equally important and worthy of attention. The balance had been restored, and with it, my sense of dignity and self-worth. The plane lifted off as the sun was setting, carrying me toward adventures I had chosen for myself, funded by money I had decided to spend on my own pleasure, on a schedule that served my own interests rather than everyone else's convenience. It felt like the beginning of everything I had been too afraid or too selfless to pursue. Below me, the landscape grew smaller, until the familiar patterns of my old life disappeared entirely, replaced by the vast possibility of open sky and unknown destination. For the first time in decades, I was traveling light, carrying only what I needed for my own journey rather than everything everyone else might require from me. The freedom was intoxicating, and I finally understood what Eleanor had meant about losing that look of someone who had been taking care of everyone but herself. I could feel my face changing, my posture straightening, my spirit expanding to fill the space I had finally allowed myself to occupy. This was what it felt like to matter to yourself as much as you mattered to other people. This was what it felt like to be both generous and self-respecting, both loving and boundaried.
This was what it felt like to be fully alive. The flight to Italy was more than transportation. It was a passage between two versions of myself. As the plane carried me across the Atlantic, I felt the final threads connecting me to my old life of constant availability and self-denial beginning to dissolve. By the time we landed in Rome, I was no longer the woman who measured her worth by how much she could sacrifice for others. I was someone ready to discover what life could offer when approached with curiosity rather than obligation. The 2 weeks in Italy exceeded every expectation I had harbored during my months of planning. The painting instruction revealed a talent I never knew I possessed, and watching my watercolors capture the golden light of Tuscan hillsides filled me with a satisfaction I had never found in any of my domestic accomplishments. The cooking classes taught me techniques that transformed simple ingredients into celebrations, and sharing meals with fellow travelers from around the world reminded me how much joy could be found in conversations with people who had no agenda regarding my usefulness. But the most profound change happened in the quiet moments between activities, when I would sit alone in a cafe or walk through ancient streets without anyone expecting anything from me. For the first time in decades, I experienced the luxury of my own company without the underlying anxiety about what others might need in my absence. I discovered that I was actually quite good company for myself when I wasn't constantly monitoring everyone else's emotional temperature. I returned home bronzed from Mediterranean sun and carrying canvases I had painted with my own hands. But the external changes were nothing compared to the internal transformation. The woman who walked back into her house in early October was fundamentally different from the one who had left in September. I moved through my transformed living spaces with confidence and ownership, no longer feeling like a caretaker maintaining property for other people's occasional use. The first test of my new boundaries came within days of my return. Sarah called with her characteristic assumption of my availability, asking if I could watch Emma and Tyler for the weekend because she and Marcus had been invited to a wedding in another state. Her tone suggested she expected the same automatic agreement she had always received, the same willingness to drop everything to accommodate her needs. "I'm sorry," I said, the words feeling strange but liberating in my mouth. "I'm not available this weekend." The silence that followed was profound. Sarah had never heard me decline a request to help with the children, and she seemed genuinely confused about how to process this unexpected response. "Not available?" she repeated, as if the words didn't make sense in this context. "What do you mean? Do you have plans?" "Yes," I said simply, though my only plan was to enjoy my first weekend home from Italy without obligations. "I have plans." "Well, can't you change them? This wedding is really important to Marcus's career, and we've already RSVP'd. Yes, we're counting on you, Mom." The phrase "counting on you" had once been enough to override any resistance I might have had to inconvenient requests. Now it struck me as presumptuous rather than flattering. When had I agreed to be someone they could count on regardless of my own needs or desire? "I understand this is inconvenient," I said, maintaining the calm tone I had practiced during my meditation sessions. "But I'm not changing my plans. You'll need to find another solution." The conversation that followed revealed just how deeply Sarah had internalized the belief that my time and energy belonged to her family by default. She cycled through disbelief, frustration, guilt tactics, and finally a kind of wounded bewilderment that I found both sad and enlightening. "I don't understand what's gotten into you lately," she said finally. "You've been acting so strange since your surgery. Maybe you should talk to someone about this change in personality. It's not like you to be so selfish." The accusation of selfishness would have devastated the old version of me, but now I found it almost amusing. Protecting my own time and energy after decades of freely giving both was seen as a personality disorder rather than a healthy adjustment. The fact that Sarah couldn't conceive of my refusal as legitimate revealed everything I needed to know about how she viewed our relationship. "I'll talk to you later," I said. "I hope you find a solution for this weekend." After hanging up, I sat in my sunny kitchen drinking tea from my mother's china and marveled at how different I felt. There was no guilt, no anxiety about Sarah's anger, no urge to call back and rescind my refusal. I had stated my boundary clearly and kindly, and how she chose to respond was her responsibility, not mine. The weekend passed peacefully, filled with activities I had chosen for my own pleasure,
organizing my Italian photographs, experimenting with recipes I had learned abroad, and working on a watercolor inspired by the view from my hotel balcony in Portofino. When Sarah called on Sunday evening to tell me they had managed to find a babysitter, her tone was cool but resigned, as if she was beginning to understand that something fundamental had shifted in our dynamic. This pattern repeated over the following weeks, as Sarah gradually discovered that I was no longer the automatic solution to every scheduling challenge or childcare need. I said yes when I wanted to help and when it was genuinely convenient. But I also said no without extensive justification or apology when the request didn't align with my own plans or energy level. The shift was particularly evident during Emma's school play in November. In previous years, I would have volunteered to help with costumes, attended every rehearsal, and coordinated an elaborate post-performance celebration at my house. This time, I simply bought a ticket like any other audience member and enjoyed the performance without feeling responsible for anyone else's experience. Sarah seemed bewildered by my hands-off approach, asking multiple times if I was sure I didn't want to host a family dinner after the play or help with Emma's costume alteration. Each time I declined, she looked at me as if I had become a stranger, someone whose responses she could no longer predict or control. The confrontation I had been expecting finally came in December, precipitated by my decision to spend Christmas traveling rather than hosting the elaborate family celebration that had become traditional. I had booked a Christmas cruise, something I had always wanted to do but had never considered because my house was expected to be the center of family holiday activities. When I announced my travel plans during a brief family dinner in early December, the reaction was swift and dramatic. Sarah's fork clattered against her plate as she stared at me in shock. "You're leaving for Christmas," she said, her voice rising with incredulity. "But what about our tradition? What about Emma and Tyler's Christmas memories? Where are we supposed to have dinner?" "I imagine you'll have dinner at your own house," I said calmly, cutting my chicken with steady hands. "That's what most families do." Marcus joined the conversation with his characteristic tone of reasonable authority, as if he were mediating a business dispute rather than discussing family plans. "Mom, Clark, I think Sarah's point is that the kids are used to coming here for Christmas. This house is like Christmas headquarters for them. Changing that suddenly seems kind of harsh." The word harsh hung in the air like an accusation. I set down my silverware and looked around the table at their expectant faces, recognizing that this was the moment when I would either reassert my old role or fully claim my new independence. "I've hosted Christmas in this house for 15 years, I said, my voice steady despite the rapid beating of my heart. "I've cooked, cleaned, decorated, organized and cleaned up again every year. This year I've decided to do something different." "But what?" Emma asked, her young voice carrying genuine confusion. "Don't you want to be with us for Christmas?" Her question pierced through my defenses more effectively than any of the adult argument. I looked at my granddaughter's earnest face and felt the familiar tug of guilt and responsibility that had governed my choices for so long. "I love spending time with you," I told her honestly, "but Grandma wants to try something new this year. Sometimes adults need adventures too." "Can we come on the cruise with you?" Tyler asked innocently, and I saw Sarah's eyes light up with possibility. "This is a trip just for me," I said gently but firmly. "But maybe next year we can plan an adventure together." The conversation continued for another hour, cycling through arguments, negotiations, and emotional appeals. Sarah alternated between anger and wounded bewilderment, unable to comprehend how I could choose my own desires over family expectations. Marcus focused on the practical complications my absence would create, as if my primary value was logistical rather than personal. But I remained unmoved by their protests, protected by the sense of self-worth I had cultivated during my months of intentional living. I no longer needed their approval to justify my choices, and I no longer felt responsible for managing their emotions about my decisions. The dinner ended with an uncomfortable silence, and promises to talk about this more later, but I knew there was nothing more to discuss. I had made my choice, and they would have to adapt to this new reality, just as I had adapted to years of being taken for granted. The weeks leading up to my departure were marked by a subtle shift in family communication. Sarah's calls became less frequent, and more businesslike, focused on necessary coordination rather than casual conversation. When I saw Emma and Tyler, they were slightly distant, as if they had been instructed not to express too much enthusiasm about spending time with their unpredictable grandmother. But I also noticed changes that indicated growth and adaptation. Sarah began making her own holiday plans, researching catering options, and discussing with Marcus how they would handle Christmas dinner at their house. The children seemed excited about the prospect of creating new traditions in their own home, and I realized that my constant availability might have prevented them from developing their own family rituals. During this period, I finalized the changes to my estate plan that I had been contemplating since my surgery recovery. Working with Mr. Peterson, I restructured my will to reflect my new understanding of how family relationships should function. The bulk of my estate would now go to charities that supported education and the arts, causes that had always been important to me, but had been overshadowed by family financial obligations. I established modest trust funds for Emma and Tyler that would provide for their college education and give them some financial security in early adulthood, but these amounts were significantly smaller than what Sarah would have inherited under my previous will. I also included a detailed letter explaining my reasoning, not out of spite, but out of a desire to teach them about the relationship between respect and reward. The most difficult part of this process was writing the letter that would accompany my revised will, a document that would be read only after my death, but would serve as my final communication about the values I hoped to pass on to my descendant. I spent weeks crafting language that was honest without being vindictive, clear without being cruel. I have restructured my estate plan, I wrote, not out of anger but out of a desire to align my legacy with my value. I believe that inheritance should reflect the quality of relationships, not simply the accident of biology. Those who have shown genuine care and respect during my lifetime are those I choose to benefit after my death. I went on to explain specific instances where I had felt undervalued or taken for granted, not to assign blame but to illustrate the patterns that had influenced my decision. I described my hope that future generations would understand the importance of treating family members as whole people worthy of consideration and respect rather than resources to be exploited. The letter concluded with expressions of love and forgiveness, but also with clear boundaries about what I expected from family relationships. Love is not just a feeling, I wrote. It is a series of choices about how we treat the people who matter to us. I hope my final choices will teach you something about the love I would have liked to receive while I was alive to appreciate it. Signing those documents felt like the completion of a long journey towards self-respect and authenticity. I was no longer living in hope that my family would spontaneously develop greater appreciation for my sacrifices. Instead, I was taking responsibility for establishing the terms under which I would participate in family relationships going forward. Christmas morning found me standing on the deck of a cruise ship in the Caribbean, watching dolphins play in the wake as we sailed toward Barbados. I was wearing a new dress I had bought specifically for the trip, jewelry that had been locked away in my safe for years, and a smile that came from the deep satisfaction of having chosen my own adventure. My phone buzzed with Christmas messages from Sarah and the grandchildren, photos of their morning at home, and updates about their dinner preparations. Their messages were warm but slightly stiff, as if they were still adjusting to my absence from their celebration. I responded with enthusiasm about their activities, and shared a few photos of my own beautiful surroundings. But what struck me most about these exchanges was their equality. For the first time, we were all sharing our Christmas experiences rather than me facilitating theirs. They were creating memories in their own home while I was creating memories of my own choice. The balance felt healthy and sustainable in a way our old dynamic never had. The cruise exceeded my expectations in every way, filled with interesting people, beautiful destinations, and activities I had never imagined enjoying. I learned to salsa dance, tried snorkeling for the first time, and spent hours reading on quiet beaches without anyone needing anything from me. The other passengers, many of whom were also traveling solo, treated me as an interesting individual rather than someone's mother or grandmother. One evening, while sharing dinner with a retired professor named William and a widow named Catherine who had become my traveling companions, I realized how much my conversational skills had atrophied during my years of family-focused living. These new friends were interested in my opinions about art, politics, travel and literature, topics I hadn't discussed in depth for years, because family conversations always revolved around schedules, problems and practical concerns. You have such interesting perspectives, Catherine said as we watched the sunset from the ship's deck. Have you ever considered writing about your experiences? You have a way of seeing things that I think other people would appreciate. Her suggestion surprised me, but it also sparked something I hadn't felt in years: professional ambition. During my working years before marriage, I had enjoyed writing reports and presentations, finding satisfaction in crafting clear, compelling communication. The idea of writing for pleasure rather than utility felt both foreign and appealing. When I returned home in early January, tanned and energized from my solo adventure, I found that my absence had indeed forced my family to develop greater independence. Sarah had successfully hosted Christmas dinner, with help from Marcus's mother and sister, and the children had adapted to celebrating at their own house rather than mine. More importantly, I sensed a subtle shift in how they related to me. Sarah's first call after my return included genuine questions about my trip, curiosity about my experiences rather than just polite inquiries about my well-being. Emma and Tyler wanted to see photos and hear stories about the places I had visited, treating me as someone who had interesting adventures, rather than just a reliable caretaker. This new dynamic was tested again in February, when Sarah asked for my help with a financial emergency. Marcus had been laid off from his job, and they needed help with their mortgage payment while he searched for new employment. In the past, I would have immediately offered whatever amount they needed, viewing their crisis as my responsibility to solve. Instead, I listened to their situation with sympathy but also with clear boundaries about what I was willing to provide. I offered to loan them enough money to cover 1 month's mortgage payment, with a written agreement about repayment terms and time. When Sarah expressed surprise about the formal loan structure, I explained that treating family financial arrangements as business transactions protected everyone involved. But Mom, Sarah said, we're family, we don't need contracts between us. Actually, I replied, we do. Clear agreements prevent misunderstandings and resentment. If you need more help than I'm comfortable providing, you'll need to explore other options. This conversation revealed how thoroughly my family had internalized the belief that my resources were available to them, without limits or conditions. The idea that I might have boundaries around financial assistance was as foreign to them as my Christmas travel plans had been. But I maintained my position, and after some discussion they accepted my terms. Marcus found a new job within 6 weeks, and they repaid the loan according to our agreement. More importantly, they began treating me as someone who chose to help rather than someone who was obligated to solve their problems. Spring brought opportunities to deepen the interests I had discovered during my transformation. I enrolled in a memoir writing class at the community college, inspired by Catherine's suggestion that I had stories worth sharing. The process of crafting narratives about my life experiences was both challenging and therapeutic, helping me understand patterns I had never recognized while living through them. My instructor, a published author named James, who had taught writing for 20 years, encouraged me to consider submitting some of my work for publication. You're writing about experiences that many women share but rarely discuss openly, he said after reading an essay I had written about learning to say no to family demands. There's an audience for this kind of honest reflection about family dynamics and personal growth. The idea of sharing my story with strangers felt simultaneously terrifying and exciting. Writing had become a way of processing my experiences, but the possibility that my words might help other women recognize their own patterns of self-sacrifice added deeper purpose to the activity. I also continued with my watercolor painting, joining a local art association that organized monthly exhibitions and plein-air painting sessions. My work improved steadily, and I found deep satisfaction in capturing moments of beauty that spoke to me personally rather than creating things that would please other people. The combination of writing and painting gave me a sense of identity that was entirely separate from my family role. When people asked what I did, I could say I was a writer and artist rather than defining myself solely through my relationships to other people. This shift in self-perception was subtle but profound, affecting how I moved through the world and how others perceived me. Summer arrived with an invitation that would have been impossible for me to accept during my years of constant family availability. Eleanor had organized a month-long painting retreat in the south of France, and she invited me to join her small group of artist friends, for what she described as serious creative work in beautiful surroundings. The old version of me would have immediately thought of reasons why such a trip was impossible: the expense, the time away, the potential family emergencies that might arise in my absence. The new version of me thought first about how much I would enjoy the experience and then figured out how to make it possible. When I told Sarah about my summer plans, her reaction was markedly different from her response to my Christmas cruise. Instead of protest and guilt tactics, she expressed genuine excitement about my artistic pursuits and asked to see some of my recent paintings. This shift indicated that she was beginning to accept my new priorities as legitimate rather than temporary rebellion. The month in France was transformative in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Working intensively on my art while surrounded by other serious artists pushed my skills to new levels and deepened my understanding of what I wanted to express through my work. But equally important was the experience of living for 4 weeks with my own interests as the primary focus of each day. I returned home with a portfolio of paintings I was genuinely proud of and a clear vision for how I wanted to structure my life going forward. Art and writing had become more than hobbies; they were vocations that gave my days structure and purpose beyond family relationships.
The most significant test of my new boundaries came in August when Tyler broke his arm during soccer practice and needed someone to help with his care during his recovery. In the past, I would have immediately rearranged my schedule to provide whatever assistance was needed for as long as necessary. Instead, I offered specific help within clear parameters. I could drive him to appointments twice a week and stay with him for a few hours on Wednesdays when Sarah had to work late. But I wouldn't cancel my writing class or art sessions, and I wouldn't be available for emergency coverage without advance notice. Sarah accepted these terms without argument, and I realized that she had learned to work within my boundaries rather than constantly testing them. Tyler recovered well with the more limited but still meaningful support I provided, and I remained engaged with my own activities throughout his healing process. Fall brought recognition for my creative work that validated my decision to prioritize artistic development. One of my essays was accepted for publication in a literary magazine focused on women's experiences, and 2 of my paintings were selected for inclusion in a regional art show. These external acknowledgments of my creative abilities felt wonderful, but even more important was the internal satisfaction I felt about pursuing meaningful work. The essay that was published dealt with the challenge of maintaining family relationships while establishing personal boundaries, drawing on my own experiences without identifying specific family members. The editor told me that they had received numerous responses from readers who connected deeply with the themes I had explored. "You've articulated something that many women struggle with but don't know how to discuss," she said. "Have you considered expanding this into a longer work? There's definitely an audience for a book-length exploration of these issues." The suggestion planted a seed that would grow throughout the winter months as I continued working on memoir pieces in my writing class. The idea of sharing my story more widely began to feel less like exposure and more like service, a way of helping other women recognize that they too could reclaim their lives from patterns of excessive self-sacrifice. As the first anniversary of my surgery approached, I reflected on the extraordinary changes that had occurred in my life during those 12 months. The woman who had recovered alone from gallbladder surgery while her family enjoyed their Disney vacation had been transformed into someone who traveled solo to foreign countries, pursued creative passions, and maintained loving but boundaried relationships with family members. The changes weren't just personal; they had affected my family dynamics in positive ways as well. Sarah had developed greater independence and problem-solving skills when she could no longer rely on me as an automatic solution to every challenge. Emma and Tyler had learned to appreciate my presence as a choice rather than taking it for granted, making our time together more meaningful for everyone involved. Most importantly, I had discovered that loving my family deeply was completely compatible with loving myself equally. The zero-sum thinking that had governed my earlier approach to relationships had been replaced by a more mature understanding that everyone benefited when each person took responsibility for their own happiness and growth. My estate plan remained changed, reflecting my commitment to rewarding the relationships that had been built on mutual respect and genuine care, rather than exploitation and assumption. But I no longer thought about that legal document with bitterness or regret. It had become simply a practical reflection of my values, a way of ensuring that my final gift to my family would be the lesson that love requires effort and consideration from all parties involved. The woman I had become was someone I genuinely liked and respected, someone whose company I enjoyed, and whose choices I could defend with confidence. I had learned that it was possible to be both generous and self-protective, both loving and independent, both family-oriented and individually fulfilled. As I sat in my art studio on a quiet Sunday afternoon, working on a painting inspired by my memories of the French countryside, I felt a deep satisfaction with the life I had created for myself. It wasn't the life I had planned during my years of focusing entirely on family needs, but it was infinitely richer and more authentic than anything I could have imagined when I was trapped in patterns of compulsive caretaking. The phone rang with a call from Emma, now 11 and full of questions about my latest painting project. As we talked about color choices and composition, I marveled at how different our relationship had become. She saw me now as a whole person with interesting activities and opinions, not just as a source of cookies and unconditional availability. After we hung up, I returned to my painting with a smile, adding touches of golden light that reminded me of both the Tuscan hills, where I had first discovered my artistic abilities, and the Caribbean sunset I had watched from the deck of my Christmas cruise ship. Each brushstroke represented a choice I had made to honor my own dreams, alongside my love for others. The woman who had been abandoned during surgery had found something far more valuable than the family support she had initially sought. She had found herself, and that discovery had made everything else possible. The years that followed my transformation brought challenges I hadn't anticipated, but also rewards beyond anything I could have imagined during my darkest moments of recovery. Living authentically turned out to be more complex than simply setting boundaries and pursuing personal interests. It required constant navigation between my new understanding of self-worth and the deeply ingrained habits of a lifetime spent prioritizing others. The first major test came during Tyler's senior year of high school when he was accepted to his dream college, but the financial aid package fell short of covering his full expenses. Sarah called me on a Tuesday evening in March, her voice carrying the familiar tone of barely controlled panic that had once automatically triggered my rescue instincts. "Mom, we've run the numbers a dozen times," she said, launching into an explanation of tuition costs, living expenses, and the gap between their savings and Tyler's needs. "We're about $30,000 short, and we've already taken out loans for Emma's college fund. We just don't know what else to do." The old version of me would have immediately offered to cover the shortfall, viewing Tyler's education as naturally falling under my sphere of responsibility. The new version listened with sympathy while calculating what I was actually willing and able to contribute without compromising my own security or enabling continued financial dependence. "I understand this is stressful," I said when Sarah finished her explanation. "What options are you considering?" The question seemed to surprise her. She had called expecting an immediate offer of financial assistance, not a discussion of alternative solutions. After a pause, she mentioned that Tyler could attend the local state university for significantly less money, or take a gap year to work and save money, or look into additional scholarship opportunities. "Those all sound like reasonable options. I'm willing to contribute $10,000 toward his education, but you'll need to figure out how to handle the rest." The silence that followed was profound. Sarah had clearly expected me to solve the entire problem, just as I had solved countless financial emergencies over the years. The idea that I might have limits on what I was willing to provide, or that I might expect them to exhaust other options before turning to me, was still difficult for her to accept. 10,000. She repeated. "Mom, that barely makes a dent in what we need. You know we wouldn't ask if we had any other choice." "Actually," I replied gently, "you asked before exploring those other choices. Tyler is a smart, capable young man. If he really wants to attend that particular college, he can find ways to make it work that don't involve me paying for a third of his education." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Sarah cycling through various arguments about Tyler's potential, the importance of education, and the unfairness of limiting his opportunities because of money. But I remained firm in my position, protected by the financial planning I had done with Jennifer and the clear understanding of what I could afford without jeopardizing my own future. Tyler ultimately chose to attend the state university, where he thrived academically and socially, while graduating debt-free, thanks to my contribution combined with his parents' savings and his own part-time work income. More importantly, he learned valuable lessons about resourcefulness and personal responsibility that he might never have developed if I had simply written a check to solve his problem. The experience taught me that my new boundaries weren't just about protecting myself from exploitation, they were also about helping my family develop skills and resilience they would need throughout their lives. By refusing to be their automatic solution to every financial challenge, I was actually giving them the gift of learning to solve problems independently. This principle was tested again when Emma decided she wanted to study abroad during her junior year of college. The program was expensive, and Sarah approached me with the same expectation of financial assistance that she had held regarding Tyler's education. This time, however, the conversation went differently from the start. "I know you've been setting limits on what you're willing to help with financially," Sarah said, "but Emma has this amazing opportunity to study art in Florence, and I thought you might be especially interested since you've become so involved with painting yourself." I appreciated the acknowledgement of my boundaries and the recognition of my artistic interests, signs that Sarah was learning to approach our relationship with greater respect and awareness. We discussed Emma's program in detail, and I was genuinely excited about her opportunity to study in a city where I had spent memorable time during my own artistic development. "I'd love to support Emma's artistic education. Why don't we set up a meeting where she can tell me about the program herself and we can discuss how I might help?" This approach was different from my previous pattern of either automatically saying yes or flatly refusing. Instead, I was engaging with the request as a collaborative decision that took into account both Emma's goals and my own interest and resources. When Emma visited to discuss her study abroad plans, I was impressed by her preparation and genuine passion for the opportunity. She had researched the program thoroughly, understood the costs involved, and had already secured partial funding through scholarships and savings from her part-time job. She wasn't asking me to solve her problem, she was asking me to partner with her in pursuing her dream. We arranged for me to cover half of her remaining expenses, with the understanding that she would work during the summer to earn the other. More importantly, we planned for me to visit her in Florence during my own planned trip to Italy the following spring, creating a shared experience that would benefit both of us. Emma's study abroad year became one of the most rewarding aspects of my new approach to family relationships. We exchanged regular emails about her artistic discoveries and mine, sharing photographs of paintings and sculptures that inspired us. When I visited her in Florence, we spent a magical week exploring museums and galleries together, two artists at different stages of development, but united by genuine shared passion. The trip also gave us uninterrupted time to talk about family dynamics and relationships in ways that had never been possible when I was always focused on caretaking responsibility. Emma confided that she had been confused by the changes in my behavior after my surgery, but that she now understood I had been unhappy in my old role even if I hadn't expressed that unhappiness directly. "I'm glad you started doing things for yourself," she said as we sat in a cafe near the Ponte Vecchio, sketching the scene before us. "I think I was learning some bad habits about how to treat people who care about you. Watching you set boundaries has taught me that I need to think about what I give to relationships, not just what I get from them." Her insight was more valuable to me than any expression of gratitude could have been. Emma was learning lessons about reciprocity and respect that would serve her well in all her future relationships, lessons she might never have learned if I had continued to model unlimited self-sacrifice as the standard for love. The success of my new approach to family relationships gave me confidence to expand my social circle and pursue deeper friendships with the people I had met through my various activities. Eleanor had become one of my closest friends, and our shared experiences traveling and creating art had developed into a rich, mutually supportive relationship. When Eleanor's husband passed away unexpectedly during my third year of transformation, I was able to provide the kind of support I had always wished for during my own times of grief and crisis. I helped her navigate the practical details of funeral arrangements and estate matters, offered companionship during the difficult early months of widowhood, and eventually encouraged her to join me on my annual trip to France. The experience of being needed by someone who also genuinely cared about my well-being was revelatory. Eleanor appreciated my help but also insisted on reciprocating with emotional support, practical assistance and shared experiences that enriched both our lives. I finally understood what healthy interdependence looked like,
how people could care for each other without losing themselves in the process. My writing had evolved from therapeutic journaling to serious creative work, and I was making progress on the book-length memoir that several editors had encouraged me to develop. The process of crafting a coherent narrative from my experiences required me to examine patterns and insights I had never fully articulated, even to myself. Working with a developmental editor named Patricia, I learned to balance honesty about my family's treatment of me with compassion for their perspectives and limitations. The goal wasn't to vilify anyone but to explore how well-intentioned people could fall into destructive patterns when boundaries and expectations weren't clearly established. Your story resonates because it's not about good people versus bad people, Patricia explained during one of our working sessions. It's about how families can lose their way when individual needs get subsumed by group dysfunction. Readers will see themselves in both your situation and your family's behavior. The book proposal was picked up by a small but respected publisher that specialized in women's memoirs and self-help narrative. The advance wasn't enormous, but the validation of having my story deemed worthy of publication felt more valuable than any amount of money could have been. When the book was published 18 months later, under the title Reclaiming Myself: A Journey from Self-Sacrifice to Self-Respect, the response exceeded everyone's expectation. The reviews were positive, but more importantly, I received hundreds of letters and emails from readers who shared their own stories of feeling invisible within their families or friendship. Many of these correspondents were women around my age who had spent decades in caretaking roles and were struggling to establish identities beyond their relationships to others. But I also heard from younger women who recognized the early warning signs of excessive self-sacrifice in their own lives and were working to establish healthier patterns before they became entrenched. The book tour that followed was both exhausting and exhilarating. Speaking to audiences about boundary setting and self-advocacy felt like natural extensions of the personal work I had been doing for years. But more rewarding were the individual conversations with readers who approached me after events to share their own stories and ask for advice about their specific situations. One woman in particular stayed with me long after our brief conversation, and she was about 45 with teenagers at home and aging parents who expected her to manage their medical appointments and household maintenance. She looked exhausted in a way I recognized from my own mirror during the years before my surgery. "I don't know how to start saying no," she told me. "Everyone is so used to me handling everything. If I stop, I'm afraid everything will fall apart." "Everything might fall apart temporarily," I admitted. "But then the people who care about you will figure out how to handle their own responsibility. And if they don't care enough to adapt, then you'll learn something important about those relationships." Her eyes filled with tears as she nodded, and I could see her beginning to imagine what her life might look like if she stopped trying to control everyone else's comfort and started prioritizing her own well-being. The success of my book led to speaking opportunities that I had never imagined pursuing. I was invited to address women's groups, book clubs, and even corporate audiences about topics related to boundary setting and authentic communication. The irony wasn't lost on me that my years of invisible service had prepared me to be visible in ways I had never expected. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Tyler, now in his senior year of college, wrote me a letter that arrived on the 3rd anniversary of my surgery. In it, he thanked me for the changes I had made in our family dynamic and credited my example with helping him understand how to maintain healthy relationships with his girlfriend and friends. "I used to think that loving someone meant always doing what they wanted," he wrote. "Watching you learn to say no taught me that real love includes having standards for how you treat each other. I'm dating someone now who respects my boundaries and has her own, and our relationship is so much better than anything I had in high school when I thought conflict was always bad." His insight revealed that my transformation had affected the next generation in ways I was only beginning to understand. By modeling self-respect and healthy boundaries, I had inadvertently taught my grandchildren lessons about relationships that would serve them throughout their lives. Emma's development had been similarly influenced by the changes in our family. Now in her senior year of college, she was applying for graduate programs in art therapy, a field that combined her artistic talents with her interest in helping people heal from trauma and relationship dysfunction. "I think watching you change your life after Grandpa died, and then after your surgery, made me realize how much art can help people process difficult experiences," she told me during one of our regular phone conversations. I want to help other people the way creating art helped you find yourself again. Her career choice felt like a natural extension of the healing our family had experienced, and I was proud to have played a role in inspiring her desire to help others navigate their own transformation. As I approached my 5th year of living according to my own values and priorities, I reflected on how much had changed, not just in my external circumstances, but in my fundamental understanding of what it meant to love and be loved. The relationships that had survived my transformation were stronger and more honest than they had ever been when I was trying to earn affection through constant accommodation. Sarah and I had developed a friendship that would have been impossible when I was primarily her childcare provider and financial safety net. We could have honest conversations about books, current events, and our respective challenges without my constantly monitoring her emotional state or worrying about whether I was meeting her expectations. When she called now, it was usually because she wanted to share something interesting that had happened or to get my perspective on a decision she was considering. The tone of our conversations had shifted from transactional to genuinely social, and I found myself looking forward to her calls rather than bracing for the next request for assistance. Marcus had evolved as well, treating me with a respect that had been absent during the years when he viewed me primarily as a convenient resource. He occasionally asked my advice about work situations or sought my perspective on parenting challenges, approaching me as someone whose wisdom and experience were valuable rather than whose services were expected. The changes in my family relationships had ripple effects that extended beyond our immediate circle. Marcus's mother, who had initially been critical of my increased boundaries, began setting some limits of her own with her other children after watching how much our family dynamic had improved. Sarah's sister commented that she was inspired by my example to pursue artistic interests she had abandoned during her own years of intensive child rearing. My story seemed to give other women permission to examine their own patterns of self-sacrifice and consider whether their current arrangements were truly serving everyone involved. Several friends from my book club and art classes had made significant changes in their own lives after observing my transformation, and we often discussed the challenges and rewards of living more authentically. The financial independence I had maintained through careful boundary setting had allowed me to pursue opportunities that would have been impossible if I had continued depleting my resources to solve other people's problems. In addition to my annual trips to France and Italy, I had been able to purchase a small studio space where I could work on larger paintings and potentially teach classes to other aspiring artists. The studio, located in a converted warehouse that housed several other artists, became a second home where I could focus entirely on creative work without the distractions of household management or family obligations. The other artists in the building were people who understood the importance of protecting time and space for creative development, and our conversations about art and life were stimulating in ways I had missed during my years of domestic focus. One of my studio neighbors, a sculptor named David who was about my age, had become a close friend and occasional collaborator. We had developed an easy, comfortable relationship based on shared interests and mutual respect rather than need or obligation. When people asked if we were romantic partners, I found myself saying that we were something better, genuine friends who enhanced each other's lives without trying to complete or fix each other. The possibility of romantic relationships had been something I had avoided thinking about during my early years of transformation, partly because I was still processing my grief over Robert's death and partly because I was focused on developing my individual identity. But as I became more comfortable with who I had become, I found myself open to the possibility of companionship that would complement rather than compromise my independence. David and I had talked about this openly, acknowledging that we both valued our autonomy too much to merge our lives in traditional ways, but appreciating the warmth and connection that came from spending time with someone who truly understood and supported our individual goals. Whether our friendship would evolve into something more romantic remained to be seen, but I was no longer afraid of either possibility. The confidence I had developed through years of authentic living had affected every aspect of my daily experience, from the way I dressed to the way I moved through public spaces. I no longer felt the need to minimize my presence or defer to others automatically. I spoke up in group conversations, expressed opinions that might be controversial, and took up space in ways that would have felt presumptuous during my years of compulsive self-effacement. This shift was particularly evident during family gatherings, where I now participated as an equal rather than serving as the event coordinator and cleanup crew. During Emma's college graduation celebration, I was able to sit at the table throughout dinner, engaging in conversation, and enjoying the meal rather than constantly jumping up to refill drinks or clear plates. The celebration felt different from previous family events in ways that went beyond my changed role. Everyone seemed more relaxed and genuine, freed from the performance of either being constantly grateful for my service or constantly in need of my assistance. We were able to focus on Emma's achievement and enjoy each other's company without the underlying tension that had characterized our interactions during the years when our relationships were structured around obligation, rather than genuine affection. As I looked around the table at my family, all of us older and hopefully wiser than we had been during the crisis that had catalyzed my transformation, I felt deep gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this point. The woman who had recovered from surgery alone while her family enjoyed their vacation would barely recognize the person I had become, just as the family members who had once taken my service for granted had evolved into people capable of reciprocal, respectful relationships. The changes hadn't happened overnight, and they hadn't been easy for any of us, but they had been worth every difficult conversation, every disappointed expectation, and every moment of doubt about whether I was being too selfish or too demanding. I had learned that teaching people to treat you well is one of the greatest gifts you can give them, even when they don't initially appreciate the lesson. My estate plan remained structured to reflect my values about relationships and reciprocity, but it no longer felt like a punitive measure or a final statement of disappointment. Instead, it had become a practical expression of my belief that inheritance should flow to people who had demonstrated genuine care and respect during the benefactor's lifetime. The letter that would accompany my will had been revised several times as my family relationships evolved, and the current version reflected both the pain of my earlier experiences and the hope generated by our family's growth and healing. I wanted my final communication to acknowledge how far we had all come, while still maintaining clear principles about how family members should treat each other. More importantly, I no longer thought about my death primarily in terms of what I would leave behind. I was too busy living to spend much time planning for my absence. The legacy I hoped to leave was not just financial but experiential, the example of a woman who had refused to disappear into service, and had instead claimed space for her own dreams and development. As evening fell and I sat in my studio working on a painting inspired by the Tuscan landscape I had fallen in love with during my first transformative trip to Italy, I reflected on the unexpected turns my life had taken. The woman who had once measured her worth by how much she could sacrifice for others had become someone who understood that the greatest service she could provide was the example of living authentically and courageous. The paintbrush moved across the canvas with confidence born of years of practice and self-discovery, each stroke representing choices I had made to honor my own vision, rather than defer to other people's expectations. The painting would never hang in a major museum or sell for thousands of dollars, but it was mine in ways that transcended monetary value. It was the visual expression of a life reclaimed, a spirit restored, and a woman who had finally learned to love herself as thoroughly as she had always loved others. Outside my studio windows, the city lights twinkled in the gathering darkness, and I could hear the distant sounds of other people living their own complex, imperfect lives. Somewhere out there were women struggling with the same patterns of self-sacrifice I had once accepted as inevitable, and men learning to value the people who cared for them, and families working to balance individual needs with collective love. My story was just one among millions, but it was fully mine in ways it had never been when I was trying to make everyone else happy at the expense of my own fulfillment. And that ownership, that authentic claim to my own experience and choices, made all the difference between a life lived and a life merely survived. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.